before I get into the bulk of this video, I just wanted to say I was very happy last night on MLB opening day when one of my favorite players from one of the Dodgers minor leagues, James Outman, hit an absolute dinger. I've really been singing his praises, especially on my Twitter, so I hope it's the start of a great career with the Dodgers. But without further ado, let's get into the MVP talk now.
Three. He throws to the end zone. Davis 4-3 in the win. Oh, it's good. Crosby in on goal. Backhander. He scores. And good. 49ers win it.
Earlier in the year, I made a video about the insanity of the early season MVP race, where it seemed like there was like 6 legitimate MVP candidates at one point. However, that did come to a bit of an end, as right now there's kind of 3 big candidates with Giannis Antetokounmpo, Joel Embiid, and of course Nikola Jokic. So let me talk about some of the other candidates I really had up there, but kind of unfortunately fell off a little bit. The first one is going to be Jason Tatum. I still think he's kind of has an unsung case, and he always had a little bit of an unsung case, especially when the Celtics were absolutely on fire. But at one point the Celtics were far and away the best team in the NBA with their win record, but the Celtics kind of hit a little bit of a slide when they lost to they blew a big lead to the Knicks, the Cavs as well. And they were kind of on a skid, and I think that kind of set the tone a little bit for his MVP case, unfortunately, even though he still has a really good record. The Celtics are still the number 2 seed in the East, just only like a game or 2 behind the Milwaukee Bucks. But unfortunately, these voters, and especially with how close everything else is, it's really hard to kind of have everything go against you. But that's what kind of what happened with Jason Tatum, unfortunately. But next player would be Kevin Durant. Kevin Durant is still an absolute beast. He averages just a little over 29 points per game. But the problem is he's only played 43 games this season. He started off the Nets. He got hurt with the Nets. He got traded to the Suns. And then with the Suns, he played a couple games. Then he had a really bad ankle injury. And he played, I believe, last night as well. But the most amount of games an MVP has missed would be 14 by Bill Wan a few years ago. And, of course, Durant has missed around almost 30 games. Finally, we have Luka Doncic. And this one's the easiest to explain. The Mavericks, unfortunately, are just not a good team. They're well below 500, and the voters are not gonna like that. They do not give the MVP award to great players on bad teams, and it really sucks because at one point the Mavs were looking really okay. They had the 4th seed at one point in the West, and even though that was a little bit low for an MVP vote, but of course, they really fell off, especially after the Kyrie trade, but I'll talk maybe more about that at a future date after the Mavs season is probably going to be ending soon, unfortunately. So, without further ado, let's get into kind of like the big 3 of the MVP voting, which would be, as I mentioned before, Giannis Antetokounmpo, Joel Embiid, and Nikola Jokic. So, I'm going to start off with Giannis's case a little bit. I'll be kind of covering all of them. Giannis, out of the 3 MVP candidates, is the most defensively orientated. The Bucks have the 3rd highest defensive rating and the highest overall ranked defense. Even though I understand he's not the best defender on his own team, Brook Lopez is, you still have to give credit for Giannis because I still think he's one of the most switchable players in the league still, and he's the most switchable still on the Bucks. It's just, at the same time, Lopez has such a great interior defense as well. Though his scoring is not as high as Embiid's, it's still a bit better than Jokic's, and the main thing about Giannis is that he's still overall the best player on the best regular season team, as the Bucks have a 71.4 win percentage, which is the highest in the league right now. So, all the times MVP votes and MVP voting does go to best player on the best team, and that's how you kind of see MVPs, is that's how you think it should go. I understand if you like Giannis a lot. Next player, however, it's going to be Joel Embiid. JoJo is the current scoring leader. He averages around 33.4 points per game, 1.7 blocks per game, and 1.1 steals per game. His case is mainly on an individual dominance compared to the other two, because the Nuggets and the Bucks both have better records by the Sixers, not by much, but still. I think Embiid kind of has a little bit more of a more balanced game. He's a bit of a better scorer than both Giannis and Jokic, while still also being a really good defender. I still am not sure if he's as good of a defender as Giannis, but he's still really up there, of course. And then, same thing with as I mentioned before, he does score a little bit more with Giannis, as he is the scoring leader. So, lastly, of course, last but certainly not least, we have Nikola Jokic, who's played the most amount of games, which if you care about games played, that kind of thing, especially with all the load management going on, he's played 67 games. The other ones have only played 61 and 62 games as well. He's not as much of a scorer as the other two. He only averages a little bit over 22 points per game. The main thing about Jokic, which makes him a lot harder to compare to Giannis and Joel Embiid, even if people really like to do it, would just be he's a lot more of a facilitator at a center position, which is a really unique combination, and he executes that to perfection. He averages 9.9, almost a round up to 10 assists per game. Especially as a center, that's really good. He's a double-double machine. He still averages, I think, a little over 9 rebounds, like 8-ish, 9 rebounds per game as well. So he is just an absolute triple-double machine. And I understood for a while the Nuggets had they were 20-0 at one point, I believe, whenever Nikola Jokic had a triple-double in one of their games. And then, of course, he's very efficient. He averages those 22 or so points per game off only 63.4% field goal percentage. So it's as I'm kind of mentioning right now, even though the three I'd say best players right now, they're the 3 MVP candidates. Nikola Jokic, at the end of the day, it's kind of hard to compare him to Embiid and Giannis just because his game is more so on facilitating, setting up his teammates, making sure the ball gets in the right spot. He has just absolute dimes. He's a lot better of a facilitator than just a raw scorer. He's just more of a he takes a lot fewer shots, but obviously he's not really a volume guy at all, which makes it a lot more difficult to compare because I have no idea what Jokic's numbers would be if he had the same amount of shots as Giannis or Embiid does, but at the same time, he doesn't really need to take as much shots because he's a lot better at setting up his teammates and kind of organizing the offense as well. So, kind of going off of that, right now, because of how close the MVP race is, like, really, a lot of it just comes down to if you're more of a defensive guy, best player on the best team, you might go with a guy like Giannis. If you're looking for more of a scorer who's still a two-way beast, Embiid. If you're looking for a guy who sets up his teammates and obviously one of the biggest impacts on the floor, and then you see a big difference off the floor, Nikola Jokic has that kind of in his bag as well. So it's so hard to kind of compare, especially Jokic to some of the other guys. Even Embiid and Giannis still play a little bit differently just because Embiid's a little bit more of like a roam kind of defender that kind of situates that a little bit more differently because he still puts up better numbers technically, but overall Giannis and his team has the better defensive numbers as a unit. So it just really depends. Are you more oriented on team success? I can see you going on more of like a Jokic or Giannis. If you're just looking at individual numbers, if you want more of just raw scoring, I see it. I would totally understand if you like Embiid more, but if you want to look at really advanced stats like a Raptor, I'll get into more of that later, plus minuses, Jokic really has that in his bag. So it's at this point where it's just so close. It really just depends on what you want. You're like, obviously, if you're a Nuggets fan, you're going to want Jokic to win, and I understand that completely. Also, as I mentioned before, if you're more of a team defense guy, Giannis is your guy. If you're more of a scoring guy, Embiid, so on and so forth, a facilitator, Jokic is averaging some of the most amount of rebounds, assists, and those two stats really well. And as a center, that's really special because most centers are not even in the top 10 of assists ever. So that's one thing you really have to consider. But I think a big problem with that is because of how close the MVP race, as I keep kind of harping on, people are kind of really taking narratives like overboard. And if you've been listening to this channel for a little bit, I'm really not a narrative kind of guy. I like to look at things more objectively. Obviously, I still think it's fun to look at those and you have to acknowledge those from time to time. But I'm just more of a guy. I like to look at raw stats. And the thing is, even with stats, people are going to, as I mentioned before, people are going to look at some stats a little bit better. Like some people might like scoring more than assists or defense, for example. So even with stats, people are still going to be a little bit more subjective on which stat is actually better for a team, for an individual as well to kind of prop up. So that's why people have just been really kind of toxic, I guess. That's the best way I can put it. Especially because recently Embiid got load managed for a game, which would be on the road against Nikola Jokic, and I think a lot of people were really, really kind of looking forward to that game just because, fairly or not, if Embiid won both games against Jokic, I think that could have really sealed that kind of case against Jokic, but because he only played one game and he won that one game, people are going to kind of see Embiid as a cop-out for not playing that game, and I don't think that's really fair just because load management, it's just how it's a thing in the NBA at this point. You kind of have to just learn to deal with it. Whether that's the best course of action for the NBA to take or whether they should not allow that, that's a story for a completely different day. But of course, as it stands right now, load management did affect a couple of the matchups, which people do put a lot more stock on than I think they should, just because at the end of the day, a win is a win in the win column. So even if it's against Jokic, Giannis, or Embiid, if you're like some of the other guys, or even guys like, as they kind of mentioned before, like a Tatum or like a Kevin Durant on whatever team he was playing for. Like, if you care about those ones a little bit more, that's more power to you. But at the same time, I'm as more so of a, or let's look at it as total amount of wins and just in general. So, as I mentioned before, also objectively speaking, the Giannis, Embiid, Jokic are, it's like really comparing apples and oranges, especially with how they all play the game. So especially because you can look at it as on an individual standpoint, but also you have to acknowledge Giannis takes a little bit more free throws than Embiid. He takes like just like point 0.3 free throws, but a little bit more. Embiid just makes more free throws, and then of course Jokic is a lot more of a facilitator. Then you have to understand teammates also play a big part, and people don't really realize that just because y'all want to talk about the most valuable player, but Embiid has James Harden, who's more of a point guard now, but still James Harden can really set up the offense, take a little bit of a load off him as well. Giannis has a great defender besides him, Brook Lopez, while Jokic doesn't have the same caliber of teammates, but the teammates he does have really kind of fit together, especially KCP's a 3 and D guy, so he's not getting in the way of touches for Jokic. Jamal Murray, he can be a little bit inconsistent, but still, Aaron Gordon's still pretty good, especially defensively, and Michael Porter Jr. as well. So a lot of those guys, they're not as good as some of like the individual teammates the other two have. They still fit Jokic a lot better than it's like, other than Harden, sometimes the Sixers depth is a little bit questionable, and that really shows how much of an impact Embiid has. So that's what's really hard to compare MVP candidates when we're being really objective about it, just because they all have different teammates, they all provide for their teammates in different ways, they'll set up their teammates in different ways. I know Embiid's not really a facilitator at all. That's mainly James Harden's job on that team, while Jokic does do that, even though he's not a point guard at all. So you really just have to kind of decide on what you think matters a little bit more on, just because they're all really similar in the standing. It's not like a guy like, if Luka Doncic, if his team had a better record, that would be really interesting, just because I'm kind of going on a tangent, but at the same time, if Luka had a winning record and he didn't have Kyrie, it'd just be like, obviously Luka is just carrying this team because his supporting cast is nowhere near as good as Nuggets, the Sixers, the Bucks at all. Like the Giannis, Embiid, and Jokic, they all have a little bit of help, even if they're not all-star caliber guys at certain points. That's still help that Luka just does not have at all. And if he had a better record, I think we'd be talking about him a little bit more. But because records matter so much for an MVP race, that kind of just doesn't apply, unfortunately. So, as I kind of mentioned another thing, kind of going on my point about how it's hard to really compare these guys, I'd still say that it's honestly easier to compare Embiid and Giannis, just because they're both kind of two-way bigs who both really get a lot of free throws. They both are really impactful defensively, while Jokic plays a little bit more of like kind of like a point guard position, even though he's a center. So, in my opinion, this is only my opinion, so if you want to disagree, just leave that down in the comments below. That always helps me as well. So, with all that being said, of how I compared all these players with me comparing Giannis, Embiid, and Jokic, my MVP as of this moment, obviously there's still a couple games left in the season, and who really knows if that will impact the final decision, but I'm going to go with Joel Embiid. My main reason would just be, I think Embiid gets it done on both ends of the floor while taking a little bit less shots per game than Giannis. He's a scoring leader, and on if you want to use some advanced stats, which long story short, I'm going to use player impact estimates, which is based on efficiency off shots subtracted by turnovers. That he leads that category by a little bit as well. So I think that's really important, because defensively he gets it done, offensively he gets it done. While that's just because I think being a two-way player matters than just being really good on defense, but also just not really being an offensive guy, and vice versa. And I think obviously Giannis has a little bit better defense, and Embiid just still has a better offense, even though he takes a little bit less free throws per game as well. Even though people kind of get that narrative stuck in their head that Embiid takes the most free throws, Giannis takes a little bit more if you check out the stats, which kind of surprised me actually when I was researching this video, but kind of getting back on track. At the same time though, I'm not gonna argue too hard or get too upset if you say Nikola Jokic is MVP, just because when you look at a lot of the advanced metrics, which I know a lot of Jokic fans kind of get called nerds for this, but when you look at his stats, he has an insane Raptor, which kind of Raptor basically means, long story short, the difference between him on the court, first team, and off the court, and he leads that category by a long shot, and he has a little over 660 plus minus for the season. And if you want to look at those stats, if you think those stats are more important than just raw points per game, blocks, steals, all that kind of jazz, I understand completely that you'd probably want to go with Jokic if you're more into really deep analytics. And I wouldn't blame you for that, just because Jokic does a different job than Embiid at the end of the day. They both play center, but they just play it so differently. I can really see some people is wanting more individual dominance, while someone wanting more of like a team-oriented, setting up your teammates to be the best that they can be, as Jokic does as well. Well, I still think my rankings will just be Embiid's a little bit higher than Jokic, and then Giannis is a little bit below Jokic. I'm not gonna sleep on Giannis either. Giannis is still one of the anchors on an elite defense for one of the best teams in the league entirely as well, with the Milwaukee Bucks having the best records they mentioned before. So like I understand if you want to look at best record, best player, best record, Giannis is probably gonna be your guy. And I know a lot of like the older guys on TV and all those guys are a lot more Giannis fans, while a lot more people, I guess, kind of on social media are a little bit more Jokic. While I see still a bunch of Embiid as well. I know when I asked the poll about who do you guys think is the MVP of the NBA, the majority of people did say Giannis. So I understand if you think Giannis, is because, as I mentioned before, best player, best team. He still has elite defensive numbers. He still averages a little over 30 points per game. More power to you. I respect your opinion 100%, just because I'm not going to really knock anybody for saying this guy's MVP. I like this guy a little bit more. As long as, for me, you just give reasoning, if you give an explanation for your opinion, I'm not going to really go after you too hard, especially for something so close like this MVP race has been. I think this has to be one of the closest MVP races I've ever seen following the NBA, especially for the top three. And then earlier in the season, as mentioned before, guys like Luka, Tatum, even guys like John Morant, before all that stuff kind of happened, those guys were kind of getting their names thrown around. But obviously, as time went on, as records kind of started getting a little bit more in place, these three guys I still say are the most solidified top three in anyone's MVP kind of charts. It just really depends. If you're more of a scorer, if you emphasize more like assists, if you emphasize team defense, all that kind of stuff. That is, at the end of the day, even though you can use a lot of MVP to track MVP stats, you can use a lot of like stats. You can use a lot of objective measures. It's still subjective on which ones you think are going to be better, because it's because at the end of the day, even if I don't like to say it out loud, the MVP award is still based on narratives, and that's just kind of how the a lot of media voters are gonna vote on, especially just because I didn't talk about this earlier, because I think it's a really stupid way to discount someone for an MVP trophy. But I understand Jokic has won it back to back, and Giannis won like 2 of them already, so I'm pretty sure the voters don't want to give it to them again, even though that's completely stupid. If, let's just say, all things are said and done, Jokic gets a little bit higher of a stats, and maybe Embiid doesn't play as well towards these last couple games or so, and Jokic kind of takes it. I want to really be mad, because at the end of the day, he's still great. He still has his role as an MVP candidate, as an MVP winner. And so, if people do believe that, if you really truly believe that someone does not deserve MVP, or they deserve MVP just because they already had a couple of trophies, I think that's really stupid. Just because they were the MVP before doesn't mean they're not the MVP now. That kind of happened. That's happened to a lot of players, unfortunately. Even guys like Michael Jordan, like, he was still probably the best player, but they gave it to Barkley and Malone. LeBron James was at one point the best player forever, and they gave it to other guys because they probably want to give it to him every year. And then, so that's what I kind of mean. So, I'm not opposed. If Jokic three-peats as MVP, I think he would deserve it, just because, as I mentioned before, he sets up his teammates really well. And if Giannis gets it, I want to be mad if he gets like his third MVP, I believe. So, or if Embiid gets his first MVP, I want to be mad at it, because at the same time, I understand the arguments, I understand the stats that back up all three of these just super uber talented players who all have some of the best teams in the league. And I'm not gonna be one of those guys who are gonna be, Jokic already won it twice, so they should give it to Embiid, or that. I also don't believe that just because you give it to Embiid doesn't mean it's like a pity award just because he didn't win it a couple of years back. Even though he was really close, I still thought Jokic's MVPs were fairly won, even though some people might disagree on that. So that's why I just try to take as much narratives, much bias as I can out of some of these kind of discussions, is because I'm not really into that kind of jazz. I'm not really into arguing about this player does this or doesn't do that, so he's worse just automatically, or kind of just explaining that just because he missed a game that was, I guess, important for whatever reason, that he doesn't deserve it. I don't think that's fair at all for any of the players, and I think people are just kind of doing that as a little bit of a crutch for some of the reasoning, and it's kind of harmed a little bit of the discourse, just because I see a lot of just Jokic liners saying how he's a traffic cone, just stuff like that, just based on defense, and then I see how Embiid, people always complain that he gets a lot of free throws and a lot of ref calls, and then people always complain Giannis is traveling, just stuff like that, and I don't think that really should impact MVP voting or who you think should be MVP at all, but of course, that's just my opinion on it. If you guys have a different opinion on any of these candidates, or if you think someone else completely I didn't talk about at all deserves MVP, or if you think maybe they'll take some of the playoffs into account, because I know it's happened before, even though it shouldn't have. Let me know. Let me know down below. I'll talk to you guys later. Next week, make sure to tune in, because I'm gonna be kind of covering the first week of MLB. So far, I understand we've only had like one game at the time of recording this video, so I'll cover who's doing really good so far, all the star players, teams that are really doing good. I'll talk to you guys later. Have a nice one.